Once upon a time, in the great halls of Western diplomacy, there existed an unshakable belief that the global South couldn't possibly stand without the crutch of Western aid, Western advice, and, of course, Western approval. It was a system as old as empire itself, a polite empire these days dressed in suits and soft power rather than red coats and rifles. But the principle remained: dependency is good, provided it flows in one direction. And then came a man like Ibrahim Traoré, young, poised, unapologetically African, and perhaps worst of all, in the eyes of Washington, Brussels, and Westminster, self-reliant. Self-reliance, you see, is dangerous. It suggests that a nation could chart its own path, that a leader might say no to the IMF, thanks but no thanks to the military advisors, and absolutely not to the puppeteer strings often disguised as partnerships. And Traoré, he didn't just whisper these heresies. He shouted them on the world stage with the quiet confidence of someone who's not looking for applause. To the untrained eye, he's just another African leader in military fatigues. But look again. He's not selling his country to the highest bidder. He's not smiling for the cameras while signing deals that drain his nation's future. He's not playing the game. He's rewriting it. And the West? Oh, it's nervous. Because here's the real fear. What if it works? What if Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations by GDP, begins to rise without Western lifelines? What if the so-called backward corners of Africa stop begging and start building? What if aid dependency isn't broken by think tanks in London, but by young soldiers in Ouagadougou who refuse to be anyone's client state? You see, Traoré's threat isn't military, it's ideological. He's not just resisting foreign control, he's modeling a different kind of leadership, one rooted in dignity, sovereignty, and the radical idea that Africa might actually belong to Africans. And for the architects of global order, the ones who penned the rules but never played by them, this is terrifying. So in this episode, we're going deep, not into conspiracy but into context, into why the West smiles on dictators who obey but scorns leaders who think, into why self-reliance is portrayed as isolationism, into why Traoré is feared, not for what he might destroy, but for what he might build. Because when a man rises without permission, the empire gets nervous. Let's begin. Let's play a little mental game. Imagine, just for a moment, that you're a European power sitting in a grand hall somewhere in Berlin in 1884. You've brought your rulers, not the ones with crowns, the ones with inches and centimeters. And you're about to slice a continent you don't own like a Sunday roast. You know nothing about the languages, the tribes, the cultures. All you know is rubber, cocoa, diamonds, and where to stick your flag. And so, with the calm bureaucracy of a civil servant ordering lunch, you redraw Africa. Fast forward to today, and voila. The map still looks like something a drunk cartographer drew after mistaking tribal borders for spaghetti. But here enters Ibrahim Traoré, the man who looks at this jigsaw puzzle of post-colonial chaos and says, let's start over. Now, let's be very clear. Traoré isn't talking about geography like some New Age life coach suggesting you realign your chakras. He's talking about sovereignty, real, actual, uncomfortable sovereignty, the kind that says, we don't want your NGOs that function like polite colonizers in branded t-shirts. We don't want your military training exercises that mysteriously end with more weapons than water pumps. And we certainly don't want your economic partnerships where you take the gold and leave us with the potholes. His vision is seismic. It challenges everything the West comfortably assumes about Africa. In the minds of many Western politicians, African sovereignty is fine, as long as it's kept theoretical. Like a museum exhibit, admire it, talk about it, maybe even sponsor a documentary. But under no circumstances should it leave the glass box. But Traoré shatters that glass. He said it openly. Burkina Faso will no longer be dictated to by powers who believe aid is a leash disguised as charity. He's called for collaboration between African nations based on mutual respect, not IMF handcuffs. And here's the part that causes migraines in Western think tanks. He's actually doing it. He's nationalized resources, kicked out foreign military forces masquerading as security allies, and begun pushing for regional self-defense coalitions among African nations. In the eyes of the West, this is madness. In the eyes of Africans long tired of imported democracy delivered by drone, it's liberation. And here's the darkly comic twist. The very countries that lecture Traoré about democracy are the same ones that have no problem doing oil deals with Saudi monarchs or sending weapons to strategic partners with zero press freedom. Apparently, sovereignty is only virtuous if it's inconvenient for China. Britain, yes, dear viewer, your beloved Albion, often fancies itself as the wise post-colonial uncle who's moved on from empire. Yet when Traoré tells the world he doesn't need lectures from a nation that once claimed it brought civilization to Africa while simultaneously looting its museums, we're suddenly reminded. The past isn't even past. Traoré's vision doesn't just redraw maps, it redraws narratives. He reframes Africa not as a continent begging for aid, but as a continent demanding agency. And that terrifies the West. Why? Because it flips the script. The donor becomes the debtor. The teacher becomes the pupil. And the empire, well, it gets a history lesson. To the average British viewer sipping their tea and watching this unfold with mild intrigue, here's a suggestion. Imagine if a leader stood up in Westminster and said, "No more foreign interference, no more corporate capture, and we will run this country for its people, not for profit." You'd call it radical, maybe even revolutionary. Now imagine that leader actually meant it and had no offshore bank account to run to when the backlash begins. That's what Traoré is doing, but not for votes, not for headlines, for something that makes many Western leaders deeply uncomfortable: principle. So the next time you hear a pundit on the BBC muttering about stability in Africa, ask yourself, stability for whom? Because Traoré isn't trying to stabilize colonial leftovers. He's trying to build something new, from scratch, and on his own terms. And that, dear viewer, is the most dangerous thing of all, a man who isn't waiting for permission. Imagine, if you will, a generous neighbor. He offers you dinner every night, free of charge. Lovely roasts, fine wines, pudding for dessert. There's only one catch. Every evening, you must sit at his table, listen to his stories, follow his rules, and never ever question the ingredients. That's the essence of Western aid to Africa. The official line? We're here to help. The unofficial reality? We're here to help ourselves. For decades, aid has been paraded as a shining symbol of Western benevolence. British politicians, American presidents, EU commissioners, they all beam at press conferences pledging billions in assistance. And yet somehow poverty persists, infrastructure crumbles, healthcare fails, and every new loan comes with more strings than a marionette show in Covent Garden. Because let's be honest, it's not help, it's leverage. Take the infamous IMF loans. They're sold as lifelines but operate more like nooses. In exchange for financial support, African nations must adopt structural adjustments, privatizing public assets, cutting social spending, opening up to foreign corporations. Translation: let us buy your water, your hospitals, your energy, and oh, while you're at it, make it easy for our companies to move in tax-free. You call that generosity? That's the economic version of a Trojan horse, except the horse wears a suit, speaks in spreadsheets, and demands you repay him with interest. And what of the NGOs and charities? Yes, many do genuine, on-the-ground work, but even the best intentions are often funded by the same governments that perpetuate the problems. A British charity builds schools while a British mining firm evicts entire villages. One hand gives pencils, the other takes the land under your feet. Then there's the media circus, documentaries with weeping children, hungry mothers, flies over swollen bellies. Cue guilt. Cue donations. Cue applause for the kind-hearted Western savior. But you rarely see the roots. Who funded the war that led to this displacement? Who backed the regime that failed these people? Who profits from the chaos? And here's the kicker. This system of aid is not just inefficient, it's strategically designed to maintain dependence. A truly self-reliant Africa, One that builds its own roads, grows its own food, controls its own resources. That's a threat. Not to the people, but to those who've been quietly feasting off the continent for centuries. Because a self-reliant leader doesn't need the World Bank's permission to invest in agriculture. He doesn't need a green light from Brussels to nationalize his resources. He doesn't wait for USAID to hand him fertilizer. He develops his own. And that kind of autonomy, that terrifies the West. Enter Traoré. This isn't a man content with being politely managed. He doesn't bow for grants or beg for aid. Instead, he's building a model that says, we can and must do it ourselves. From reclaiming state control of key industries to rejecting IMF dictates, his approach is a direct challenge to the established order. And suddenly, Western headlines label him authoritarian, populist, dangerous. Curious, isn't it? When a European leader defends national sovereignty, it's patriotism. When an African does the same, it's tyranny. Traoré's stance unmasks the hypocrisy. If the West truly believed in development, they'd cheer his efforts. But they don't, because their aid isn't about uplifting Africa, it's about managing it. Let's not forget the British legacy here. The colonial project may have ended formally, but its logic persists. Only now it's dressed in suits, wrapped in aid packages, and spoken in the polished tones of international cooperation. A British minister once said, "We want to ensure aid supports good governance." Translation, we want leaders who do what we say. But Traoré isn't playing that game. And in doing so, he's exposing the house of cards, the aid industry, the debt traps, the double standards. They begin to tremble when faced with a nation determined to stand upright. So yes, the West fears self-reliant leaders, because such leaders can't be bribed with conference invitations or silenced with grant money. They can't be bought with praise in The Guardian or cowed by lectures from the Foreign Office. They are immune to moral blackmail and economic blackmail alike. And most dangerously of all, they inspire others. A self-reliant Africa doesn't just mean lost profits. It means a new political imagination. It means shaking off the mental chains of inferiority. It means no longer needing to ask permission to breathe, build, or dream. So next time you see a photo of a Western leader handing a giant check to an African president, ask yourself who really benefits. Because aid in its current form is not a gift. It's a business deal, wrapped in a bow, sealed with debt, and delivered with expectations. And Traoré? He just said, "No, thank you." Imagine a leader who treats the age-old Western help narrative like a bad joke, politely declining the handouts laced with strings and choosing instead to chart his own course. This is Traoré, the man who, by refusing to bow before the altar of international creditors, has shaken the very foundations of global power dynamics. He is not just another African politician playing the tired game of borrowing and groveling. He is a statement, a challenge, and a headache for the West. For decades, the story has been the same. African nations, desperate for cash, line up at the doors of the IMF, World Bank, or bilateral donors, accepting loans wrapped in conditionalities, economic austerity, privatization, deregulation. The usual laundry list of demands that strip countries of their sovereignty and hand control to foreign interests. Traoré's radical departure, he says no. No more loans, no more debt traps, no more economic strangulation disguised as development aid. Instead, Traoré advocates a bold, unapologetic vision of financial independence. He insists that Africa should build its future with its own hands and resources, not on the backs of foreign creditors whose real agenda is to expand influence, control resources, and ensure profits for their multinational corporations. His policies reflect this philosophy. Where others have bowed to IMF demands, slashing social spending on healthcare, education, and welfare, Traoré has refused to cut essential services. He channels government spending into domestic industries, agriculture, and infrastructure projects that are self-sustaining. His government has prioritized increasing tax revenue from multinational companies operating on African soil, companies that, until recently, enjoyed sweetheart deals and tax holidays thanks to Western pressure. But financial independence is only part of the story. Traoré's diplomatic maneuvers have been equally disruptive. In a move that sent ripples through diplomatic circles, he decisively cut ties with France, the former colonial overlord whose influence still lingers like an unwelcome ghost in many West African capitals. French military bases were shuttered, French corporate footprints reduced, and French aid conditionalities rejected outright. This was no mere symbolic gesture. It was a political earthquake. Instead of bowing to Paris or Brussels, Traoré pivoted south and east, seeking partnerships not as a supplicant, but as an equal. China, India, Brazil, these became his new allies in what can be seen as the burgeoning South-South cooperation movement. These partnerships were framed not as charity, but as mutually beneficial trade deals and infrastructure projects built on respect and shared interests rather than exploitation. This reorientation unsettled the Western powers, who had long treated Africa as their backyard, a playground for influence and resource extraction. The media coverage quickly turned hostile. Traoré was branded authoritarian, populist, even dangerous, despite his government holding elections that by many accounts were more transparent and competitive than those in some Western countries. This glaring hypocrisy reveals a double standard as clear as day. When European leaders assert national sovereignty, nationalizing key industries, or resisting supranational controls, they are lauded as patriots defending their country's interests. But when Traoré, an African leader, does the same, the narrative flips immediately to tyrant and threat to regional stability. Why? Because Traoré threatens the established order, one where Western governments and multinational corporations call the shots, keeping African nations locked in cycles of dependency and underdevelopment. His refusal to borrow money and accept conditional aid means no debt repayments chained to foreign interests. It means no IMF technocrats in ministerial offices telling him to privatize water or electricity. It means no Western donors using aid as a lever to influence domestic policy or electoral outcomes. This model of self-reliance is a direct rebuke to the Western aid industrial complex. It calls out the system for what it is, a mechanism designed not to uplift, but to control. And this, more than anything, terrifies the West. Traoré stands as a symbol of an Africa that refuses to be managed, an Africa that demands respect, sovereignty, and the right to forge its own destiny. In doing so, he has exposed the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath decades of Western aid rhetoric, that aid is less about generosity and more about governance. Governance that serves Western interests, not African peoples. His example inspires a new kind of politics in Africa, one where leaders are accountable not to foreign creditors or donors, but to their own citizens, where development is driven by local priorities and resources, not dictated by conditional loans. It's this threat, the threat of a truly independent Africa, that makes Traoré the West's nightmare. No amount of media demonization, economic sanctions, or diplomatic isolation can suppress the idea he represents, that Africa can stand on its own, unbowed and unbought. And as long as leaders like Traoré refuse to bow, the old scripts will keep unraveling, much to the chagrin of those still clinging to the reins of global power. Imagine this. A confident African leader stands tall, charting his own course, pushing back on decades of Western influence. He refuses to play by the old rules, insists on his country's sovereignty, and builds alliances with neighbors on his own terms. And what's the West's reaction? Alarm bells ring, headlines scream, dangerous threat to regional stability, unpredictable populists undermining peace, or the ever-classic, a challenge to the international order. Ah, yes, the West and its eternal obsession with stability. But what kind of stability are we talking about here? Let's pause and ask the obvious question. Whose stability? The stability of foreign banks collecting debt repayments? The stability of multinational corporations extracting resources? The stability of a global order built on centuries of unequal power? Because here's the truth, masked in diplomatic jargon and polished speeches. What the West calls regional stability is often just code for maintaining control. It's a polite way of saying, stay in line, don't rock the boat, and above all, don't threaten our interests. When leaders like Traoré assert their right to make independent financial, diplomatic, and security decisions, they don't destabilize anything except the monopoly on power. They don't throw the world into chaos. They simply disrupt a system rigged in favor of a few. And that's the real crime. Let's unpack this a bit. The West's favorite complaint is that such leaders threaten peace and security. But peace enforced through dependence is no peace at all. It's a gilded cage. When a nation's economy hinges on loans with strings attached, when its foreign policy is dictated in boardrooms thousands of miles away, and when its security apparatus relies on foreign training and funding, can we truly call that sovereign? Traoré's approach, cutting the apron strings and refusing to bow to external pressure, is the exact opposite. It's not chaos, it's courage. The courage to say, we will manage our own affairs. We will protect our people on our terms. We will forge our own partnerships. Yet the West frames this autonomy as dangerous. Why? Because autonomy means unpredictability. It means no longer serving as a reliable pawn in the global game. It means potential competition in global markets and a refusal to let multinational corporations exploit resources unchecked. It means challenging the narrative that only Western expertise and investment can develop Africa. Of course, this is never framed that way in polite circles. Instead, it's packaged as concern for good governance, democratic norms, and regional cooperation. Nice words, but let's call it what it is: a call to obedience. Take the example of Traoré rejecting IMF loans. The West decries this as reckless or irresponsible, ignoring that those loans come shackled with austerity measures and privatization mandates that often plunge populations into deeper poverty. When Traoré refuses, it's not just financial defiance, it's political rebellion. And it's this rebellion that rattles the old powers, because it threatens to inspire others, a domino effect they dread. What if more countries refuse to kneel? What if more African nations insist on fair trade, fair investment, and fair diplomacy? What if the continent starts rewriting the rules? The West fears that, not because it's afraid of losing profits, though that's a big part, but because such self-determination questions the very legitimacy of the current global order. This is the uncomfortable truth the media won't broadcast. The problem isn't instability, it's independence. This fear manifests in media narratives that paint independent leaders as authoritarian, populist, or dangerous. The irony? Many of these so-called dangerous leaders come to power through transparent elections, often more legitimate than those in the West itself. Yet the West's lens is tinted with suspicion, as if democracy only counts when it produces leaders they like. Meanwhile, leaders who toe the Western line, no matter how corrupt or ineffective, receive praise and funding. They're called partners, friends, or allies. The double standard is glaring, but it's part of the game. This begs a deeper question. Why does the West claim to support democracy but recoil when democracy yields leaders like Traoré? The answer lies in the limits of that support. Western democracy is a democracy with conditions that include loyalty, compliance, and an unspoken agreement to preserve the status quo. But Traoré breaks this mold. He's not asking for permission to lead. He's demanding the right to lead on his own terms. And in doing so, he exposes the hypocrisy of Western partnerships. In fact, the West doesn't want equals. It wants clients. It doesn't want partners who challenge or negotiate. It wants obedient recipients of aid and policy dictatees. The colonialism of old may have ended in form, but its spirit lingers in these expectations. So when Western media talk about threats to stability, read it as a coded message. We want leaders who keep the peace by keeping us in charge. Anything else, no matter how legitimate or justified, is cast as dangerous. But here's the kicker. True stability, the kind that comes from respect, equality, and genuine cooperation, cannot exist without autonomy. It cannot exist under the shadow of debt, influence, or coercion. Leaders like Traoré represent that possibility. They embody a vision where African nations are not dependent players, but confident actors on the global stage. This vision challenges the West's monopoly on defining what development or stability even means. And so the battle lines are drawn not between order and chaos, but between control and freedom, between old hierarchies and new possibilities. If the West wants genuine stability, it must learn to embrace autonomy, not fear it. It must accept that African nations have the right to their own paths, even if that means losing some influence, profits, or convenience. Because the future is not about preserving the past power dynamics, it's about forging new partnerships on equal footing, and leaders like Traoré, they're just getting started. Ah, the horror. Just imagine the collective gasp across Western newsrooms and policy circles the moment African countries begin to actually think for themselves. Not just mimic the old scripts, but rewrite the whole damn playbook. It's like when a student suddenly stops copying the teacher's notes and starts writing original essays. The kind of originality that's somehow threatening to the teacher's authority. There's a long-standing Western fear, or let's call it what it is, an obsession, that Africa stepping out of its post-colonial shadow and forging its own path would lead to chaos, collapse, and, well, something very bad. But what's actually happening? The opposite. A quiet revolution is brewing, and the West is scrambling to spin it as a dangerous upheaval. Take the CFA franc, for example. For decades, this currency, controlled by the French Treasury, has been the economic leash tying many Francophone African countries to their former colonizer. Critics rightly call it a relic of colonialism disguised as monetary stability. Recently, the growing pushback against CFA has become a symbol of a broader refusal to accept imposed dependencies. Now imagine the West's response. Predictable alarm, warnings of economic turmoil, and thinly veiled threats about financial instability. Because, of course, if Africa dared to manage its own currency, the comfortable system that funnels wealth back to Europe would be disrupted. Stability, they say. But again, stability for whom? Meanwhile, African nations are not sitting idly by. They're quietly building their own coalitions, economic blocs, security partnerships, and political alliances that bypass traditional Western influence. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, is a prime example. A bold, ambitious project to unite the continent's markets, reduce dependency on external powers, and boost intra-African trade. This is exactly the kind of independent thinking that sends shivers down the spines of Western powers. It threatens decades of control disguised as partnership. And the response? Smear campaigns labeling these moves as risky experiments or immature gambits, veiling economic and political self-determination as reckless adventurism. On the security front, new alliances are emerging too. African countries are investing in their own peacekeeping forces, intelligence sharing, and regional security frameworks, rather than relying solely on Western militaries or foreign interventions. Again, this is independence in action, and again, it's met with skepticism and suspicion. Here's the irony. When Africa leaned on the West, it was criticized for being a client state. Now that it's asserting sovereignty and building new partnerships, it's called disruptive and unpredictable. Talk about damned if you do, damned if you don't. And then there's the patronizing tone, the implicit message. You're not ready to think for yourselves. The West acts like the strict teacher wagging a finger, warning the rebellious student, if you don't behave, you'll fail the exam. Except in this scenario, the exam is self-governance and self-determination, a test Africa has been acing quietly for years. When African nations refuse to follow the old scripts, Western narratives often turn to sarcasm and condescension. Who do they think they are? They're biting the hand that feeds them. They should be grateful for Western aid and guidance. But here's the inconvenient truth. Africa doesn't need the West's permission to succeed. It never did. The continent's potential for innovation, growth, and leadership has always been there, stifled only by artificial constraints imposed from outside. The moment Africa starts to imagine itself beyond dependency, through independent currencies, regional security pacts, and economic integration, it exposes the fragility of the global power structure. It's a powerful reminder that the old order depends on narratives of African incapacity, chaos, and reliance on Western benevolence. As the saying goes, when you no longer need the teacher calls you a bad student. This is the crux of the problem. African countries choosing autonomy are not disobedient children. They are mature actors demanding respect and equality. And what if this spirit spreads? What if more African nations join the chorus calling for self-determination, rewriting trade deals, forming independent security alliances, and rejecting economic neocolonialism? The West's fear isn't just about economics or politics. It's about losing its monopoly on the narrative. So next time you hear Western media warn about destabilization or rising authoritarianism in Africa, read between the lines. It's less about facts and more about discomfort with a continent that refuses to be defined by its past or its dependency. It's about a continent boldly asserting its right to think for itself and the nervous reactions that follow. Because in the end, the real threat to the global order isn't Africa's rise. It's the challenge that rise poses to entrenched power. Imagine a world where more leaders like Traoré rise, not puppets on strings, but captains steering their own ships through turbulent waters, unbowed, unapologetic, and fiercely independent. What would the West do then? Panic, most likely, because Traoré isn't just a thorn in the side of the aid industry or a headache for the IMF. He is a nightmare for the entire Western narrative on development and stability. It's ironic, really. The same voices that trumpet democracy and freedom as universal values are the quickest to brand Traoré a dangerous authoritarian. They bemoan his defiance, his populism, his refusal to dance to the tune of foreign donors. But when a European leader does the same, prioritizes national interests, rejects international meddling, suddenly it's patriotism, pragmatism, or strong leadership. Double standards? Absolutely. Hypocrisy? Unmistakably. Because here's the truth they don't want you to admit. It's not Traoré's style they fear. It's the idea of Traoré, a leader who answers first to his people, not to Brussels or Washington, a leader who sees aid not as charity, but as a chain, loans not as lifelines, but as nooses, a leader who dares to say, no, thank you, to a system designed to keep him dependent. If more African leaders embrace Traoré's model, financial independence, sovereign diplomacy, regional cooperation, the West's carefully maintained grip loosens. The rules-based international order they champion so loudly, it's a monopoly disguised as morality, a game rigged to keep one side winning. And when those rules break down, when more nations dare to carve their own paths without waiting for permission, the entire geopolitical landscape shifts. It threatens profits, influence, and centuries-old power dynamics built on exploitation and paternalism. So yes, the West fears leaders like Traoré, not because they threaten peace or stability, but because they threaten control. Because autonomy means a loss of leverage, and a loss of leverage means no more sweet deals for foreign corporations. No more tax holidays, no more resource grab masked as development aid. Here's the kicker. The West claims to want democracy, yet it fears the kind of democracy that produces Traoré. Why? Because real democracy means power to the people, and that often means power away from foreign interests. It means a continent no longer begging for scraps, but demanding respect and partnership on equal terms. And isn't that the real lesson here? That freedom isn't freedom if it's handed down like a favor or granted like a privilege. Freedom is messy, bold, and uncomfortable, especially for those who have long held the reins of power. So where does that leave us? Watching from the sidelines, are we content with the illusion of choice? Freedom only as far as it aligns with established interests? Or do we dare to imagine a different future, one where leaders like Traoré aren't anomalies but the norm? You watching this have a choice too. Support the status quo, where aid comes with strings and sovereignty is negotiable, or champion real autonomy, where nations stand on their own feet unapologetically and without handouts. If you want to see more stories that challenge the status quo and question who really holds power, subscribe now and join the conversation below. Because true freedom starts with awareness. And together we can demand a world where leaders like Traoré are not the exception, but the rule.